4 of those properties going now under some type of development. The hope is that by actually increasing ministry, you increase your resources. Now, I don't think that's so odd. You know, in James 1:27, the Lord spoke through James in saying that this is perfect religion, to meet widows and orphans in their distress and keep oneself unstained by the world. So therefore, if we do more ministry, it would appear that God would bless that. If we keep ourselves unstained by the issues of the world, all the better. So we believe that by increasing ministry to seniors, the fastest growing demographic in the country, in the world, that we will have the opportunity to enjoy the blessing through the increased ministry, which will create more resource to do ministry, which will create more opportunity, more funding for ministry. So this is one of the areas that we're working in now, and we think it really has great benefit to the church, because as our churches are getting older, we need to minister to the older members of our churches. We can create on our campuses opportunities for these dear people to be cared for and loved. So this is the initiatives that, one of the initiatives we're looking at. There have been others through the years: child daycare, counseling, day schools, K through 12 schools. All of these have been great initiatives for ministry. I think, looking at the demographic that we have today, Tim, that a lot of our emphasis ought to be towards seniors as well as toward our younger people.
Thanks, Dan. That's very good insight. So, we now have a little bit of understanding about some biblical insight. We've talked about some mistakes. We talked about how we program. But what I want to know, and I'm sure a lot of you want to know, is how do you set and develop a budget? Gary, can you give me some type of insight on that?
Yes, thank you very much. I kind of want to start just slightly before that, because how you set the budget determines on some things. Don had mentioned that one of the problems with church building and construction projects is you need to find a consensus, is the word you used. And Dan used a similar concept. He talked about a unique calling of your church, or you must have start at a starting point. And Tim used the word that churches oftentimes have a DNA, a unique characteristic of its ministries. Well, where we start is exactly at that point, and what we talk about is finding what your church philosophy of ministry is. And in order to find out what your philosophy of ministry is, you really need to sit down and work through that. Now, we're not talking about a stated goal or a motto or something like that. We're talking about something much richer and deeper. Let me give you an example. If your philosophy is that you believe in secular humanism and you believe in evolution, that we started from some amoeba and we came into human beings, your philosophy of the world might be survival of the fittest. I can kill you, and if I can get away with it, I'm better off, and so forth. But if you come from a biblical standpoint, where God created us as perfect human beings and we sinned and fell away and we are working our way back to worship and love God, and we're going to go out and carry out the greatest commission. When we go into a country, we're not going to come with tanks and guns and take it over. We're going to come in with missionaries and churches and medicine, hospitals and schools. So that starting point is very, very important. In order to set your budget, you should have a consensus or a unique philosophy, a point of ministry. Once you decide what your philosophy of ministry is, such as what Dan just used as a perfect example of an aging church, there is a whole ministry resource of getting into adult living, for example, and a whole income stream and all the things that come with that. And so you ought to be looking at things that you build that support that philosophy of ministry. If it's a youth organization, you ought to be looking at inner city schools or whatever. You're going to be looking at basketball courts, sports, counseling, parenting courses, and things like that. Okay, once you have your philosophy of ministry, then you can decide what we're going to build. And so the next issue would be space needs, and others will address that. But once you come up with your space needs and your philosophy of ministry, then you kind of know where you're starting. Now, how do you deal with the finances? We now know you're going to build something, whatever that philosophy of ministry, whatever that consensus is. And so you have to set a budget. Well, what's a budget? The budget is this. what you have cash on hand, what you can raise over the interim until you start building, and what you can legitimately and safely borrow and qualify to pay back. You add those three amounts together and you now have a budget, gross budget. And one of the areas where folks get into trouble is they don't realize all the costs that have to come out of that budget. You will be surprised to know, as we've heard, people who have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on architectural plans that will never be built. That's part of your budget. So these kinds of costs are important. I don't work for free. You better consider my brokerage commission. That's part of your budget. And one of the things we just addressed was sites. When you have a civil engineer come to the property, let me tell you, there is a profound difference if you have a piece of property that a billy goat can't climb or a flat piece of property. There's a fundamental difference whether there's granite, clay, gravel, or sand underneath that dirt. Correct? There's a fundamental difference if there's water, electric, and gas to the property, or whether they're going to bring it in over the next couple of 100 yards or a mile or so. And if you have to bore underneath an interstate highway to get those utilities, you can add another $50,000 if you can get the permit. So when we go to, if you'll go ahead and flick through this, if you will go to your budget and you start looking at all the real costs of what you're going to put. You know how many churches we have had someone come and they want us to fund, and we look at it and the first question I ask, where's your furniture, fixtures, and equipment? Are you not going to have a sound system? You're going to put pews, chairs? Oh my gosh. Well, there are folks that have tried to build churches that way and they get to that point and they got a real problem. So one of the things that we look at is whatever you have on hand, that's sort of set. And what you can qualify to borrow, we can have some influence on by the way you do your accounting, by the way we present your books and so forth. We get you appropriate so banks can understand what you're doing. But what Dan brought up is something we've been exploring with great enthusiasm: daycare programs, adult living centers. These are new streams of revenue, and they're outreaching your ministry further than you have been before. These are very, very important things in this new economy. You go to a bank. How many of you have recently been to a bank to see if you can get funding for your church? They're not hugging you and saying, "Dear brother, come in." In fact, it's quite different that they are trying to find any way to get out of the room and, "Pastor, I'm busy, I'm sorry." They're doing everything they can. It's a different world out there. And so if we're going to survive, and I believe thrive, what you have here is a group of people who understand all the elements. We had a slide earlier that says wisdom comes in the counsel of many. That's a biblical principle. And so what we have is all these disciplines coming together. They understand a budget. The first slide you saw was Luke 14:28-30, and Frank very carefully explained, if we don't have the budget set, then everything else is for naught. And so then you have the architect. He's going to design what you, the pastor, tell him to design. So they're doing their job. So you better have your consensus. You better have your philosophy, and you better understand your space needs. You're going to hear from all these gentlemen on that. So anyway, if you'll just click through the slides fairly quickly, we don't really need to take too much time. These are the calculations, cash on hand right there. You look at, these are some of the costs that you're going to have to incur. When you get that figure, click to the next. And this is simply it. If your source of funds are greater than or equal to your gross budget of revenues, then you're in good shape and you're designing biblically, and you will have a relatively seamless experience in building this church or this other structure. If the costs of what you want to build exceed what your gross revenues are, you've got a problem. And wouldn't you rather start at the beginning of the process and rescale it before you present all of these things to your congregation? We believe that our duty and our rule here is to help you prosper as a pastor and not to make the common errors that have cost so many their careers and their heartbreak as the church falls apart because they can't do what they thought they were supposed to do. Our goal here is to stand beside you as partners, not to tell you what to do, but to be sure that we do it in God's biblical way. And I want to tell you, these guys here know what they're doing. I'm the young pup on the block, and I've really learned some stuff here.
No, I'm actually the
Thank
youngest.
you.